there's a couple of points that I just wanted to ask you on, just on the back of that. I think that in terms of funding, I think something that you talked about with the London 2012 Olympics, was there a point where do you feel like the legacy should have been lengthened? So the games, obviously they've tried to introduce people to, from different communities into new sports, i.e. golf. And then the Olympics has come and gone. And then it's like, has it ceased? I mean, was there more that they could have done to sustain that accessibility to sports such as golf?
Yeah, obviously I don't know the background behind why it sort of stopped, but I definitely feel sort of back then, literally when I started, there was just so many opportunities, and there was so much money around, and hence why I got up to a stage where there was like 55 schools in one term, and then obviously it just literally just dried up. I don't know whether obviously then the idea of the funding was like, right, well, this year we're going to concentrate on golf, basketball and dance, and then next year we're going to concentrate on three other different sports. So I don't know the reasons behind it, but yeah, it definitely felt like that, we'd built up a real good momentum, and we got to a stage where we had a lot of contacts and a lot of schools. And I don't know whether with the funding it was like, well, actually now your foot's through the door, it's now up to you to continue that. Okay. But the unfortunate thing is obviously the funding went to some of the schools and some of the kids that potentially wouldn't have had those opportunities. So once you're now asking them to pay for themselves, they can't pay for that opportunity because they could do, they would have done it in the first place. And so it was sort of a back way round about it, in the harshest possible way. If you were sort of a boy who was fairly sporty to start with, from a reasonably sort of a middle class background, you didn't really get these opportunities. Part of lottery funding is obviously ticking off certain boxes, and I did feel a bit aggrieved that all these opportunities for me to go to a school were certain target groups, which I understand why it's obviously very important to include everyone, but in another way it wasn't including everyone, because it wasn't including the sporty kids that wanted to try all the sports. So it wasn't including the kid that played all the football and plays all the tennis, but they maybe not have played golf before. We potentially have missed a future star. If you've got a kid that's sporty already, but they just haven't played golf before, but they've got fantastic hand-eye coordination, they're quite athletic, they're quite on a developmental stage for their age, and then you say, well, actually, if I could have given them the golf club as a 9-year-old or an 8-year-old, and they're quite well developed, they could have ended up really taking to golf to start with, because they might have been physically able to really connect with the ball quite well to start with not much coaching to begin with, and they may have caught the golf bug and then become a golfer at the end of it, which is obviously what the aim of the funding was. It wasn't just to give you an opportunity. It was like, well, actually, we want these kids to play golf in schools, we want them then to come to a golf course, we want them to become golfers at the end of it. It's just a shame that the ceiling of it was all these kids I was coaching, and then it was like, well, that's done, and then we sort of lost them, not because they didn't want to do it, they just didn't have the means to then continue that. Whether it was obviously just their situation at home, the financial situation, whatever it was it was just a shame. So I know there is funding available, but I don't think as golf pros we know the sort of I particularly don't know the ins and outs of how a school educational system and funding works. If there's a way of finding that information out, and then we can say, well, actually, there's these opportunities. The only other thing I would say, obviously, with schools and funding is obviously then it becomes very much extracurricular. So obviously for golf pros, after school can be quite a busy time at the golf course anyway. So it got to a stage for me that I couldn't really do after school very well, because then I've got my 3 groups anyway. One thing I did enjoy is doing some PE lessons, which again was quite a rare opportunity, but I did do a few PE lessons during the school day, and then I
was just going to say, I mean, we kind of see football included in PE, we see cricket included in PE, we don't see golf included in PE. It just seems to be something that again, it's just not come through as like a mainstream sport really within the school environment.
It almost sounds like with the Olympics, where you've had that that spike, and it's grown, and it's grown to a point, and then almost like dropped off a cliff edge, like what you said. But it also sounds like there's a reliance on people within the schools to understand the sport itself.
Yeah.
We all pretty much are brought up with living and watching football. You know, it's almost stereotypical. Boys do football. Hopefully it's changed more since we were at school, but you know, boys do football, girls do netball. There might be a bit of tennis involved in the summer, maybe, or rugby, depending on the school that you go to. But you know, we're brought up with those sports because they're, you know, and athletics and things like that. But it sounds like that unless there's an intrinsic knowledge on golf, on accessibility, on how to include it, it almost sounds like if that school doesn't have that, it's not introduced.
Yeah.
Would that be fair
I
to say?
think, you know, I think the sort of the PE curriculum hasn't changed. I feel like the accessibility of all sports, and obviously, you know, again, using the Olympics as a tool. Obviously, they introduce new sports all the time. You know, like I was watching skateboarding today. You know, there's obviously there's always a flowing change of the time. So, you know, there's sports that are happening in the Olympics this year that obviously haven't been introduced before. But I think and I could be wrong, but I just think the school program for PE is quite bog standard. Like I said, you know, I when I was at school, you know, 20 years ago, it was sort of football in the winter, rugby in the winter, then sort of badminton, and then athletics, and that was pretty much it. And you know, and they were the sports that I remember playing at secondary school, and that was it. And I don't think that's really changed. You know,
it's interesting, isn't
Definitely
it?
room for development there. Yeah.
Yeah.